Corey was almost 15 when Dad came home from work one evening in the spring and said that he'd been given an assignment to go to London for a couple of weeks on business for his company in June. And he asked Corey and Mom whether they'd like to go along with him. He said, "You guys, yeah, I'll have to work for a week, um, but then the second week we could take a second week and tour around England and have a great time." And Mom and Corey agreed that would be an awesome idea. So that June, uh, about mid month, they all flew to London, and Dad went to work, and Corey and Mom had a great time touring and looking at things around London. Now, London is a great city. It's a wonderful city to visit. It has one of the great zoos in the world. Uh, it has funny little black taxi cabs. They're little kind of like sort of like mini SUVs, all always black. And remember that in England, people drive on what we consider to be the wrong side of the road, since they are a much older country than we are. Maybe they're driving on the right side of the road and we're driving on the wrong side of the road. But anyway, the taxi cabs, the driver sits on the right side of the front seat, and it's when whenever I've been there and been driving, you have to really concentrate because everything's backwards from what you're used to. So I like to have uh, a guide or somebody in the left front seat telling me the upcoming turns and telling me, where to go so I can concentrate on the driving. Uh, in fact, people, Americans acting quickly, for instance, to get on like what we would call an interstate, are going down the street and they take the wrong turn. They take what we would think would be the entrance to the interstate and zoom up it only to have a terrific crash with somebody coming down the ramp because that is the exit ramp for the British road system. Anyway, it's a lot of fun to go around in the taxi cabs. It's also a lot of fun to ride around in the bus. They have double-decker buses, and you can sit up on the upper level of the bus, and it's just a lot of fun. The other thing that they did almost every night as a family was go to plays. Now, London has movie theaters just the way we do, but one of the things that they have is a ton of theaters for plays, and there's plays going every night. And there's some great, mystery plays, comedy plays, serious plays, and it is just a lot of fun to go to plays rather than movies. And so they did that with Dad almost every night. They also, Mom and Corey also visited the Tower of London, which was sort of like a jail in the old days, but now has a museum in it. And there's a lot of different parts of the museum. One of them is the weapons and armor part, where you see the suits of armor, the broadswords, which were the long two-handed swords, more regular sized swords, the maces, with a handle with a chain and a spiked ball, um, all kinds of paraphernalia for war, for fighting. Another part of that museum is the torture room, where they show the various torture uh, designs that the English had in years ago, hundreds of years ago. One of them that interested Corey, because it's really bad, is the rack. Now, the rack is like a big wooden bed, and on each end of the bed or the platform are a couple of wheels connected by an axle or a piece of wood across. They're on one side of the bed and the other, and then they're connected by a piece of wood. Both head and tail of the bed have these wheels. Well, what they would do to somebody they wanted to get to talk or somebody they wanted to torture was they'd lie them down on the bed and they'd wrap a rope around ankles and attach it to that axle or that bar between the wheels, attach a rope around wrists, um, his or her wrists, and put the rope around the wheels at the upper end of the bed, the head end of the bed, and then start tightening the wheels in different directions, which, if you can imagine, would start stretching the body further and further and further apart. Most people didn't take too much stretching before they confessed to whatever secrets that the torturers wanted them to confess to. There was one other torture uh, cage that was pretty bad, and it was an iron cage, just about the height of a human. It was at the height of a human, or a little higher, and just about around about the size of a human. And you would be put inside the cage, and the door would then be shut on the cage, and the door on the inside of it had long spikes sticking out to the inside all over the door, and they would gradually shut the door on you. Not good. Anyway, the armor and the torture chambers were interesting. There were a lot of other things they they did during that week while Dad was working, and then Dad got done working, and it came time for their week of vacation. And Dad said, we got to go see some castles. And that's one of the things you do in England. And there's three different kinds of castles. One is where there's just foundations in the grass where the buildings were. So you kind of have to imagine what it looked like. It's just grassy, big grassy areas with these lines of where the foundations were, lines in the grass. You kind of have to imagine how the castle laid out. The second kind of castle, which is my favorite, is a partially destroyed castle. And I really like those because you can wander around. There's still walls up, some of the walls up, some of the defenses are up, but broken. The great protective walls broken, some of the buildings broken. And what I like to do is wander around and kind of imagine what caused that castle to be taken, be captured, or broken into, how it happened. And then the third kind of castle is the ones that are completely intact. And there's some features of these castles that are quite similar. And one of the features in all of them is the Great Hall. Now, the Great Hall is where the people generally lived in the castle, generally ate, and spent a lot of their time. Normally, the Great Hall has huge fireplaces on each end that could take 6, 7 foot logs. And the reason for those big fireplaces was, of course, to heat the rooms because they didn't have any heat in those days. And England can, in the winter and even in the summer, can kind of be very damp and cold, particularly in the winter. And so what they did was build these enormous fires. They had tables, of course, in there for eating and so on and so forth. And a lot of the castles in those days had huge, um, what we call tapestries, huge kind of thick, very big, what you call a blanket or a quilt, but they were big. They were 15 feet long and 8 or 9 feet wide, hanging on the walls because the walls were all stone. And to keep warmth in, these tapestries covered the walls. Today, they may have a few tapestries, but today the great halls are empty, no furniture, um, and they have pictures along the walls. Now, the pictures are of the people who occupied the castles through the centuries before, and they're not photographs, of course, they're paintings, but they're really all the same. They feature a guy holding a sword, with an expression on his face, kind of, you know, and there are lots of them, men and women, pictures down and paintings down the length of the halls. The halls are bare. Great halls are bare. Generally, there might be a rug on the floor, but they're big. They're very long and tall, and with these stone walls. Well, and then there's other parts of the castle that are interesting. But the thing is that after you've seen a few of the existing castles, they're pretty much all the same. They're not too different. So Monday of the first the vacation week for the family, they went and looked at a couple of castles. By Tuesday afternoon, they had seen a total of 6 or 7 existing castles, and Corey was getting bored. And so he, nearly 15, he wanted to see different stuff, and he was more interested in, getting out in the countryside and didn't want to keep walking around these castles. Well, Dad said there's one more we've got to see Wednesday morning. There's just one more famous castle we got to see, and then we'll go out in the countryside for the next 3 or 4 days, and we can have a lot of fun. Well, a typical teenager, Corey said, I don't like it, but okay, let's do it. So Wednesday morning, they joined a tour group of about, which is what you generally do, generally 20 to 30, maybe even a little bit more than 30 people with a guide to go through the castle. And this castle looked like any other castle. And of course, the first thing they did was go into the Great Hall. And they're walking down the Great Hall when Corey spots something totally different than any of the great halls they'd been. On the left-hand side, halfway down the hall, was a large, large painting, colored painting. Now, a lot of the portraits are just black and white. The paintings don't have color in them. This one had a lot of color, and it was probably, I don't know, it was probably 6 feet long and maybe 3 feet high, 3 feet wide. So it was a big rectangle. And it showed a battle scene. Now, in the forefront of the painting was a man in armor, and he had two hands up with a broadsword, two-handed, a big, big broadsword, two-handed sword. Facing him were four men in gray cloaks and no armor and tight leggings and regular sized swords. And the cloaks had a hood, but the hoods were thrown back, and the cloaks were thrown back over their shoulders. And they had, dark leggings and blousy. That means sleeves on their long sleeve shirts were full. They were colored. They were like blue and gray shirts, but they were blousy, and they had regular sized swords in their hands. On the ground, by the four men, was a dead or a wounded man in a gray cloak. On the ground by the man in armor was a soldier lying with blood coming out of one of his legs, lying holding his knee, bent over, sitting on the ground, bent over, holding his knee. And there was another man in armor, soldier in armor, beside the guy with the big broadsword. Now, the guy with the big broadsword had a helmet and a big black beard coming down over his armor. And his face the painting showed his face sideways. So you could see he was really angry, and his mouth was open, and he was, you'd have to say, ugly. And he had his broadsword up, ready to swing. Well, Corey thought this painting was the coolest thing. This was the coolest painting he had ever seen in a castle. And he kept studying it. And as he looked at it, he saw that the knight in armor was close and was in the front of the picture, but then there was a hill that went down to a stream with some white tents along the stream, and then the slope went up to a hill across a little valley on which was a castle. And he looked at the castle, and he could see that smoke was coming out from inside the castle walls. And he could see down the hill from the castle were small, because the painting was showing them in the distance, were trebuchets. Trebuchets were, if you don't know, they were mechanisms for throwing big rocks. And you'd wind the trebuchet up and release it, and it'd unwrap and throw a rock, a big rock, or a flaming ball of fire, whatever, at a castle, and in this case, at this castle. And there were also catapults, which were just simply the catapult bent back and then was released and would fling a rock or whatever into the castle. Now, he could also see 3 wooden towers on big wheels being pushed by soldiers towards the castle walls. Now, if you know about sieging, which means attacking castles, you know that an attacking army would build these wooden towers from lumber in the forest nearby, and they were completely enclosed in wood, and put them on big wheels. And inside the tower was made to be as high as the castle walls. And on the top of the tower was a drawbridge. that would go down. So the idea was inside the tower were ladders going up. So you'd get soldiers on those ladders inside the towers. Then other soldiers would push the towers up close to the castle walls, and the drawbridge would drop down, and the soldiers inside the tower could run across the drawbridge onto the top of the castle walls and attack the soldiers in the castle. So he faintly in the background he could see these three towers being pushed toward, that was the painting, pushed toward the castle walls. And he just stood there, and he loved this painting, and he was studying every detail of it. The knight's armor, the broadsword, the castle, the towers, all of that. And the tour group got to the far end of the Great Hall and was about to go through a door to the left and into a hallway. And the guide was telling the tour group, now follow me, we're going down this hall. Well, Corey's mom was at the back of the group, and she kept gesturing at him. Come on, come on. And he kept saying, no. Listen, Mom, I know how the castle goes. They're going to go down the hall to the kitchen. They're going to go through the kitchen. They're going to go to some other rooms. He said, I'll catch up. I just got to study this picture more. And she said, well, don't waste any time. You got to catch up right away. And he said, yeah, I'll catch up. And the group disappeared through the door. And Corey is standing there looking at this picture, and it is awesome. And all of a sudden, there is an enormous crash, and dust fills the room. Completely, the room is filled with dust. Corey can't see anything. The room is filled with dust. And he's trying to get the dust clear from his face, and finally his vision starts to clear. And in front of him, he sees an enormous figure in armor clutching a huge broadsword. And the figure turns and stares at him with enraged eyes, a big beard coming down over its armor, its chest, armor-covered chest, and roars and swings the broadsword right at Corey. Corey goes down flat on the ground, and the broadsword whistles over him. The force of the blow spun the man around in a circle because he swung so hard. And Corey is on the ground looking, and he sees four men in gray cloaks to the left, to his left, start to step forward toward this figure in armor. And Corey's going, what is going on? What is going on? And then he feels a whack on his shoulder, and he's yanked up and dragged away from the knight. He's dragged away, and almost like, he's almost like on his heels. He's being dragged away, and he turns around, and a man in a gray cloak has him by the shoulder. In one of the man's hands is a sword, and the man says to him, "Run!" and starts running himself for a line of trees behind them. And Corey is going this is crazy. But he hears the clanging of steel as sword blades clash against each other behind him, and he doesn't take any time to try and figure it out. He runs behind the guy, and the guy runs up into the trees and then turns right and runs through the trees along the top of this hill. And Corey is right behind him. He's not taking any chances. He's right behind him. And as he's racing through the trees, he glances quickly over and he sees they're on the top of a hill that slopes down to a stream. And downstream are some white tents. And he looks across and up a little hill. And on the other side, across this little valley from them, is a castle with smoke coming out of it. And 3 big wooden towers being pushed toward the castle. He's going, no way, this is impossible. At about that time, the guy in the gray cloak turns right out of the trees and sprints down the hillside toward the stream. Corey's right behind him. I mean, this is real. He's feeling ground under his feet. He feels air. I mean, it's real. And the guy is heading for a fire. There's a fire burning of is a ring of stones and a fire burning. And over the fire is suspended a big black kettle, big black container, kettle, we call it kettle, hanging over the fire. And beside the fire is a big pile of sticks. And the guy in the gray cloak runs down. While he's running down the hill, he reaches behind his back and pulls out a long shaft. That is a long piece of wood, about 6 feet long. And he gets to the fire and he puts one foot lightly on one end of the shaft and with his other hand bends the shaft over and strings a string between one tip of the shaft and the other tip. And Corey realizes it's a bow. And without hesitating, the guy grabs one of the sticks by the fire, jabs the stick into the kettle, pulls it out, and then holds the stick to the flames of the fire. And the tip of the stick ignites. That is, lights up with fire. The guy puts the stick into his bow and shoots it. And Corey realizes it's an arrow. The pile of sticks by the fire are arrows. And as he's looking, he sees that the arrowheads are all wrapped in cloth. And the guy grabs another one, jams it into the pot, which is filled with liquid, puts the tip down to the flames, it lights up, and he fires another one. And he says, more arrows! And so Corey starts grabbing arrows and doing the same thing, jamming the arrow into the pot, holding it to the flames. It ignites. The tip ignites, and he hands it to the guy, and the guy fires it. Well, the guy is shooting these arrows up the little hill at the wooden towers, attacking the walls of the castle. And in no time flat, he has 6, 7, 8 arrows stuck, flaming arrows stuck into the nearest tower. And in another minute, the side of the tower ignites in flame and starts burning. And as soon as that happens, the soldiers, in very little time, the whole tower is engulfed in flames. And the soldiers pushing it all take off running back down the valley toward the stream, and out of the bottom of the tower come all the soldiers who were on the ladders inside it, running away from this burning tower. Well, the guy in the cloak doesn't waste any time. Corey keeps handing him flaming arrows, and in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes, he has the second tower on fire, and in another 5 minutes, he's got arrows stuck into the third tower, and it's starting to smoke and burst into flame. About that time, they hear this roar from up on the hill where they had been, and they look up, and there are no more gray cloaked gray cloaked men standing. They're all lying on the ground. And the guy with the black beard and the full suit of armor, his voice, he's pointing the broadsword down at them and screaming at the top of his lungs, "Get them!" And men start running from the tents downstream from them, running toward them. And the guy in the gray cloak turns and says, "Follow me," and sprints up the hill towards the line of trees in the forest. And guys are coming after them on foot, and they run into the forest and run and run and run. And Corey's a pretty good athlete, and this guy is running so fast that Corey is hard pressed to keep up with him. But his fear is this whole thing is real. His fear is driving him on. So he stays right behind the guy, and they run and run and run. And it starts to get a little darker. And Corey realizes it's now late afternoon. And the guy, all of a sudden, and they could hear, when they entered the forest, they could hear guys shouting, but the shouting gets further and further and further behind and then disappears. The sound disappears. And the guy slows up, and there in front of them is quite a large patch of brush. And the brush is about waist high on a man. Thick brush. Without hesitation, the guy grabs Corey, pushes him down to his knees, and says, "Get in there, get in the middle of that pile of brush." And Corey starts, hands and knees, crawling through the brush, and there's sticks it's dense brush. Sticks are grabbing at his shirt and his arms and everything, and the guy keeps pushing him, and they crawl into the patch, way into the middle of this huge patch of brush. And then the guy in the gray cloak lies on top of Corey and pulls the cloak over both of them and says, "Don't move." And so it's getting darker. And then they begin to hear the faint sound of voices coming closer and closer. And finally, the voices are really close. And the soldiers are tramping through the forest, spread out in a line, looking for them. Two of these soldiers tramp right through the patch of brush. Now it's getting pretty dark now, and the gray cloak is perfect cover for the guy and Corey. And one of the guys slams a sword down into the brush 3 feet away from their head and moves on. And the voices go past them, get fainter and fainter, and then it's night. And then they hear the voices um, off in the distance going back the other way. And then it's quiet. And they lie there for several hours. And finally, the guy in the cloak says, okay, we can get out. So they force their way out through the bushes until they're standing in open ground. And Corey says, this is impossible. What's going on? I'm not even supposed to be here. What's going on? And the guy says, the castle on the far hill belongs to Sir William. Sir William is a knight that is very, very loyal to the King of England. He is the most loyal knight, and all the other knights follow him. The guy in the black beard with a broadsword is a knight named Corrick who wants to become King of England, and he is trying to rally all the knights to attack the king and kill the king and take over England. But the first knight he has to kill is Sir William. And that's what the attack is all about. And Corey's going, what are you guys doing? And the guy in the gray cloak says, there were 6 of us who are knights loyal to Sir William. And there's a secret entrance out of the castle through a tunnel. And we escaped last night and attacked Corrick, and we wanted to kill him and stop this whole invasion of Sir William's castle, but we failed. And Corey says, well, what are you going to do now? And the guy says, I have one more idea. Follow me. And starts off through the forest. And Corey says, are you crazy? I'm not even supposed to be here. I don't know what's going on. This has got to be a dream. I'm not even supposed to be here. And the guy says, I need your help. And so Corey follows him. He has nothing else to do. I mean, he ain't going to go off in the forest all by himself. So he follows the guy. And they go back to the top of the hill. Takes them a while. And they make their way through the trees along the top of the hill to where Corey at first had this broadsword swung at him. And they go past that area. And after a few minutes, the guy in the gray cloak stops and peers out of the trees. And there is a big tent set on the ground, on a piece of flat ground. And they are looking at the back of the tent. And out in front of the tent is a fire burning on the ground. And 2 soldiers stretched out, sleeping on either side of the fire. And Corey says, what's that? And the guy says, that's Corrick's tent. Now I need you to help me. And Corey says, what do you want me to do? And the guy says, I want you to go to the tent and cut a hole in it and take this rope. And he hands him a leather braided rope. He said, there's a loop on the end of this rope. I want you to slip this rope over Carrick's feet, the loop of this rope, and that's all I need you to do. Then get out of the tent. And Corey goes, "Are you nuts? How am I can't get into that tent. Are you nuts?" And the guy hands him, in the dark, feels his hand and hands him a knife. And he says, "The tent is made out of silk. All you need to do is touch the blade of this knife. You just touch the blade of this knife to the silk, and it'll cut it'll immediately cut. You can make a cut." And Corey says, "Oh, yeah, and you want me to go in there when he's in there, right?" And the guy says, "Yeah, but Karek's going to be asleep. He's going to be asleep. After the sun went down, he would have been drinking mead, which is kind of like beer. He would have been drinking mead and eating a big supper, and he will be sound asleep. Listen, you can probably almost hear him snoring." And in fact, Corey listened. He thought he could hear a snore. And Corey said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And the guy says, "I've got the other end of the rope. I've got something I've got to do with it." And Corey goes, "Okay, okay." And he really doesn't like this whole plan. But he's scared to death. He sneaks down to the tent and he puts the knife up to the back of the tent, and he puts his hand up to guide the knife, and he hits his finger with the blade of the knife and cuts himself because the knife is really sharp. And he goes, "Ah!" and starts sucking blood out of the wound because he's got a good wound on his finger. So he takes his t-shirt and cuts a piece off with the knife and wraps the finger with his t-shirt and ties it off as a bandage. And then, keeping his hands well apart, he slides the knife down the tent. And just exactly happens what the guy said would happen. Without a sound, the silk just breaks open. And he cuts it all the way to the ground, cuts the hole all the way to the ground, and with his two hands peeks in. The inside of the tent is incredible. First of all, there are rugs all over the floor. Big rugs, big thick rugs. Second of all, there is a gigantic bed, like a king-size bed, against the left side. Scattered on the floor are pieces of armor, breastplate, helmet, leg armor, weapons are scattered all over the floor. And lying on the bed with his feet stretched apart, lying on the bed is Karek, snoring just the way the Gray Knight said he would be. His feet are sticking out over the edge of the bed, over the end of the bed. So Corey goes, maybe I can do this. So as quiet as a mouse, he slips through the cut in the tent and crawls on all fours, keeping below the level of the bed to where the two big feet are sticking out. And ever so carefully, he takes the loop of the rope and slides it over the right foot. Well, the left foot is too far away. He doesn't know how he's going to get the loop over the left foot. And he starts to tighten the loop on the right foot when all of a sudden, Karek sits up sits up. Corey goes flat down on the floor by the bed, at the end of the bed, flat down. He doesn't dare breathe. And Corey kind of flummoxes around, and boom, goes back, falls back, and starts snoring. That's enough for Corey. He tightens the loop tight enough and backs his way out of the tent and into the forest. And he just leaves the rope, which is the guy in the gray cloak has the other end of the rope. He leaves the rope alone and goes back to into the trees. And he gets there, and there's the knight standing by a tree. He says, did you do it? Corey says, yeah, but I only got it on one leg. He started to wake up. And the knight says, okay, I got to get you to do one more thing. And Corey goes, what? I did what you asked. I did everything you asked me. And the knight says, I've got one more thing to do, and you've got one more thing to do, and this whole thing will be over. We will have solved the problem. Corey says, what do you want me to do? And the guy says, I want you to go around the tent to the fire out front. Grab one of the sticks, still burning in the fire, and torch the tent. And Corey goes, you got to be kidding me. There's 2 soldiers sleeping on either side of the fire. There is no way those guys are going to wake up. There is no way. And the knight says, they're whispering. They're not talking here. The knight says, don't worry. He says, those guys have been drinking mead all evening. They're not going to wake up. Just be careful. You don't drop an ember, a burning ember from the stick on either one of them. It'll wake them up. So Corey goes, are you sure I got to do this? And the knight says, yeah, it's the only way we can save Sir William. Corey says, okay. So he creeps back to the tent. Before he goes, he said, where are you going to be? And the knight says, you'll hear, just get back to these trees as soon as you torch the tent. Corey says, okay. So he sneaks down to the back of the tent, and he goes around the side of the tent and peeks out the front. And sure enough, the 2 guys, the 2 soldiers, they're snoring away, but they're on either side of the fire. He has to walk between their legs to get to the fire. And he looks around, nobody else in sight. All the other tents are down at the stream, down the little hillside. So he steps out, petrified somebody's going to wake up and see him, and starts tiptoeing in between the 2 soldiers. And they're both snoring away, and he gets to the fire, and he reaches out, and there is still a couple of thick sticks burning. And he grabs one, and he has to hold it straight out in front of him and back up. He doesn't dare turn around. He has to back up until he gets clear of those 2 soldiers, because he doesn't dare risk dropping any burning part on them. So he backs up until he's clear of their feet, turns around, the end of the stick is on fire, and torches the tent. He sets the stick against the tent. Well, the tent is made of nylon, of silk, and it ignites instantly. Instantly, the whole tent is in flames. And as that happens, he hears a horse whinnying loudly out in the forest, and then the whole tent disappears, is in a ball of fire, shoots away through the forest, and inside, screaming and yelling and screaming, is Carrick. And the tent and everything in it on fire is in a ball of fire and shoots away, bouncing off of trees, and disappears into the forest. Corey, his mouth drops open, and he's going, I don't believe this. And then he hears the two guys behind him wake up, and he sprints for the trees. And the two guys are yelling and shouting. Shouting comes from the tents down the hillside from the other soldiers. And he hears one of the two guys who was sleeping at the fire, get them, get them. And because they'd seen him, he didn't run right away when the tent ignited. He was just standing there looking at him. They seen him run to the forest. And he runs into the forest, and there's the knight. And Corey goes, what is going on? What did you do? And the knight said, I tied the other end of the rope around the neck of Carrick's huge war horse. When you ignited the tent, I jabbed the horse with my sword. He's not going to stop running for 5 miles. And we got to get out of here. And they take off, sprinting through the trees in the dark. Corey staying right behind the knight. Guys yelling and screaming coming after him. And as they are running full speed, Corey trips on a root of a tree sticking out. He trips, flies through the air, and hits his head on a rock and is knocked out. When he opens his eyes, his mom's face is about this far from him, and she's going, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're taking a nap in the Great Hall? You've got to get up. We've got to go. The tour group is almost outside of the castle. The tour guide's asking where you were. What happened to you? And Corey goes, Mom, I had the greatest dream. I got to tell you about it. And she says, there's no time for that now. Get up. And she grabs him by the shoulder, yanks him to his feet, and they run down the Great Hall to the door on the left and start down the hallway. And they can see at the far end of the hallway, they can see daylight. Another door is open, and the tour group is already outside. And Mom is running and saying, hurry, hurry. And Corey's running. And all of a sudden, he feels pain. And he looks down at his left hand, and the forefinger is wrapped with a bloody piece of t-shirt. And that is the end of the story. Now, for those of you who have good imaginations, here's an exercise. So, go back to the scene in the tent when Corey is putting the leather rope around Carrick's one foot, and Carrick thrashes around and sits bolt upright in bed and sees Corey and says, "What are you doing here?" Now you write the new ending to the story. Use your imagination and have fun with it.